Hello. I'm here with Charlie Munford. He's a biological theorist living in Vermont and also chairman of the nonprofit TalkingOctopus, whose work seeks to help us understand living systems better. He's here to talk to us about epistolution. But before we dig into what is epistolution, I would love for you, Charlie, to frame up what's the need for this conversation? Why are we having this conversation in the first place?
Definitely. Thank you, Dina. Yeah, so this conversation is necessary because for the past 80 to 100 years, basically, since the beginning of the concept of genetics, the debates about evolution have centered around this question of basically Darwinism versus God. So the premise of that debate has been either variations are totally random and natural selection is the only source of evolutionary change, or it must be God. It must be a biblical, theological explanation. That's not necessarily true. That's a false dichotomy. So it's also possible that there could be a naturalistic explanation making variations non-random. And that concept that there's a physical, non-theological explanation that's possible, an undiscovered physical chemical process that makes variations in biology non-random, that's what we call epistolution. And that's the new idea that we're here to discuss.
That's great. Okay, so going into epistolution, where do we need to start to begin to understand?
Okay, so the basics of the theory of evolution by natural selection is totally fine. Evolution does happen. Natural selection is extremely important in explaining evolution. The problem is that in order for natural selection to happen, we need variation. So variations are not consequences of natural selection. Variations precede natural selection. Natural selection picks between variations and discards some of them and retains other ones. So variations are outside of the frame of evolution in that sense. And so we have to come up with a theory of where variations come from. So originally, when the idea of natural selection was first invented, Darwin and Wallace assumed that part of the source of variation was use and disuse. And later on, they discovered genes, and they said, variations have to be blind, and they're just random mutations in these heritable particles. That's the only source of variation. And so that's the theory we have today, is that variations are considered to be blind with respect to adaptation. They just happen by accident. And those are the source of all the changes that have been retained or discarded during evolution. So, but there's a problem with that claim. So that's called the central dogma. There's something called the central dogma, which is that information can only flow from the genome, which has only random changes to it, to the soma or the phenotype, which is like your body. So it can only go from DNA to your body causally. It can't go from the body and the experiences of the body back to the DNA, because that would be Lamarckism. That would be, the 19th century theory. And so the problem is we've learned a lot in the 100 years since this idea first came around. And we've learned that, in fact, organisms do change their DNA. And they do adopt heritable changes. And so you can see all kinds of examples. There's editing happening, actually. There's transposition, there's duplication, there's horizontal gene transfer, there's epigenetic inheritance, and there's non-random mutations. So none of those fit in the normal theory of life. And so all these exceptions to the rule mean that the rule is wrong. So we have to change our assumptions. It looks like we're going to have to add something to the theory of life to make it coherent, to make it fit in the big picture of how we understand physics and how we understand causality.
Let me ask two questions in here before you keep going. Can you tell me what you're not trying to disprove here?
Totally. Yeah. So we're not adding back in God. We're not saying that God controls mutations. We're not. What we're trying to add is a new scientific conjecture about the source of variations. So it's necessary to better explain natural selection and evolution. It's a prerequisite for natural selection, and it explains it better, and it also explains a lot of other things much more elegantly. That's the reason why epistolution is a necessary concept.
You talked a lot about a paradox that we're dancing around right now, and that you're really trying to take head on right now with epistolution. Can you talk about the paradox?
Totally. So the existing theory of life right now rests on this circular argument. So the argument goes, yes, we've observed all these examples of organisms changing their heritable materials, right? Reorganizing themselves, reorganizing their DNA, editing their DNA, inheriting edits from their parents. And that's considered to be okay. Most people are just totally ignoring that because they're saying, oh, well, the DNA caused the organism to edit the DNA, right? So the DNA causing the organism to change the very DNA that was the cause, that's the circular argument, right? So either the program that causes these changes lives somewhere outside of anything that can be changed.
Can I just put a pin on that? Like there's no part of the DNA that is protected from change. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. So we can't use any part of the DNA to explain all the changes to the other parts. So that breaks the theory. That makes it self-contradictory. You know, it was coherent before we had those observations, and now it's not coherent. So we need to add something to the theory to make it better, to make it stronger.
But it's not God. It's not God. It's you're looking for a mechanism. You're looking for a new framing of how life is and comes to be and changes that isn't natural selection driven. Like that isn't we get what we get through natural selection. It's got to be something else. And you're looking for something else.
Yeah, it's a prerequisite for natural selection. You can't explain it through natural selection because variations are a prerequisite. If they're not blind and random, then
what are they?
Then what are they? Right.
So here we are with epistolution. Let's talk about it. Well, what are the unsolved problems of biology and evolution that sparked you to come up with these explanations, and that the theory of epistolution seeks to answer?
Okay, well, the most obvious one is that mutations are not random. So they're not only not random as in with regard to where in the genome they happen, but very critically, they're not random with respect to expression rates. So what that means is that if DNA is used by the organism, it's less likely to mutate. Empirically, what you could call that is use and disuse, right? If something is used in the genome, it's less likely to change.
That sounds like the definition of not blind. That can't
exactly. That can't be blind. Exactly. Okay. So that's the first major problem. So, and the second problem is just, if the genome is presenting these options for epigenetic expression, then how does the organism choose between the options? And how could those choices be heritable? If the organism chooses to express its DNA in a certain way that produces a certain behavior, and then imprints that expression onto the DNA in terms of methylation and these epigenetic mechanisms like chromatin and these things that are added to the DNA, to the underlying code, and then those things that are added are then inherited. How is the organism making those choices? Because it's certainly not a random change to the underlying code. If that's happening, then how is that happening? Because that's not part of the theory. So,
yeah, talk about crossing over.
There's a problem with crossing over because crossing over is a part of meiosis. This is in a sexual eukaryote like humans. When we make our germline cells, we make our sperm and our eggs, we mix the DNA from the two chromatids in such a way that every specific sequence stands a non-zero chance of being scrambled. There's no part of the genome that contains a code that's never scrambled. And so if that's the process and the sequence contains the instructions for the process, then where are the instructions for crossing over? because those instructions would be scrambled, just like all the other instructions. So it doesn't make sense.
I don't hear you saying that DNA does not contain information. What are you saying about DNA? What are you not saying about DNA?
Yeah, okay. Well, the configuration of DNA holds information in the same way that the configuration of neurons holds information. Like, we already have the premise in biology that information can be held in these biological structures, that acquired information can be held. The DNA holds knowledge just like a mind holds knowledge. That's based on a physical process that we don't understand yet. But this is a good step. This is a first step towards understanding what that physical process is recognizing that knowledge can be acquired by organisms and can be held in things that are part of the organism. They can be held in the structure of the organism. And if we just say that that's not unique to neurons, if we say that that's a property of all biological material that's alive, then it solves the problem. A lot of well-informed biologists have discarded the idea of the selfish gene, but they still haven't taken seriously the idea that knowledge or instruction can come from somewhere else other than inheritance. So what they're saying is, well, maybe it's not the genes, but it's the whole system. It's the whole living system. It's the whole organism, or it's the whole cell that contains the instructions. And the reason why that's even worse, that's a worse theory than the selfish gene theory, because the thing that's powerful about the selfish gene theory is it makes a separation between the genome and the vehicle for the genome. And the vehicle can get damaged and messed up during the course of life, and it can degrade, and then it can eventually die and pass away. But the genes are something kind of immortal because they're made of discrete sequences of nucleotides, so they can be corrected for errors and reproduced precisely. And so that explains how this underlying, sequence of information containing nucleotides can have been passed along for billions of years. And so there's some genes that are very, very ancient and give us these basic proteins that we can use, for many, many purposes, and other organisms can use too. So if you say that the whole cell is a heritable process, it really destroys the elegance of the genetic theory, of the theory of inheritance to begin with. And the reason for that is that there's plasticity in all the other parts of the cell. Like the code of the DNA is at least has a plausible mechanism for resisting too much plasticity. And in order to maintain this functional coherence that life forms express, we have to contain that plasticity. We have to get away from too much change, because things that change too much, it's called degradation. They just stop functioning, right? And so they just break down. So the genome as a container for knowledge is a really elegant part of the theory, and we have to keep that part of the theory because it's powerful. We can't just say, oh no, knowledge is contained in everything biological in the sense of heritable knowledge, because the non-genetic parts of biological systems don't contain the mechanism to resist decay and resist errors in the way that the genome does. So if you're gonna explain everything based on inheritance, you're really saying everything's based on genes, and that's the best version of that. But as we just discussed, that's not sufficient.
Yeah, but you're saying it's neither of those. It's not as rigid as it's genes only, and it's definitely not as loosey-goosey as it's the information is everywhere, because then everything would just degrade. You need that.
Well, acquired information is everywhere. Acquired information is totally different from inherited information, right? Inherited information has to be extremely resistant to change, because the only way it can get smarter is by natural selection. And that only happens once every generation. That kind of information has to be very resistant to change. And that's why it's a good explanation to attribute that to DNA. But if we're talking about acquired information, acquired knowledge, that can live anywhere, right? It can live in structures that are totally plastic. In fact, it does. It lives in brains. It's no mystery, or it's a familiar mystery to consider that acquired changes can live in non-genetic biological substrates like brains.
And I think what you're saying is that both are necessary. Neither one is sufficient. Both are necessary. Right. And what you're looking for is the context that holds both of them.
Right, exactly.
All right, Charlie. The question we're all here for. What is epistolution and what makes it different from the current model?
Epistolution is the process by which life understands its environment and then integrates and improves that understanding over time. It's different from the conventional explanation of biology because epistolution says that the organism uses its heritable material as tools to understand the world. So not that it inherits an instruction code that tells it exactly what to do in the world, but it inherits this toolbox of tools, and it uses the world to tell it how to use the tools, because its aim is not just survival and reproduction. Its aim is understanding the world and understanding what's out there, the causal relationships between the entities and forces that are around it, no matter what environment it's in. Epistolution is the idea that all cells are minds that are trying to understand the world. It just says, okay, we know that minds can acquire knowledge from the world. Okay, we don't really know what the boundary between the mind and the body is. In fact, that's called Cartesian dualism, and most serious philosophers have rejected that a long time ago. And they say the mind and the body are really the same thing. So let's just change that statement to the body can acquire knowledge about the world, right? And if we say that about some bodies, I don't have any sound reason for establishing a boundary below which there are no minds or there are no bodies that can acquire knowledge about the world, right? So all we have to do is change our assumption about knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge, and say it's not just about neurons and brains, it's about any biological material. Any living cell, any living organism can acquire knowledge about the causal relationships around it.
Can you just talk about what do we mean when you say mind? Because you just said cells are minds, and I'm afraid we're going to lose people unless you get very specific about what you mean when you say mind.
Yeah, mind is a structure that holds a causal map of its surroundings. It knows what things are present around it, and it knows how those things relate to each other to some degree. Epistolution is the idea that there's a universal mechanism for understanding the surroundings of an organism or a cell. So it's the idea that every cell has something called an Umwelt, which is like, it's called the world unto, right? So it's things that cell is sensitive to, or that organism is sensitive to. So if your body shape is the shape of a tree, you're going to be sensitive to things that a body shape of a dolphin is not going to be sensitive to, and vice versa, right? Just ignoring big organisms and focusing on tiny cells, imagine them in the same way as sentient little minds that understand something about their surroundings. Maybe not very much, maybe not nearly as much as trillions of cells would understand, right? It scales up from the small to the big. But our own minds are affected, and some might say even constituted by things like our gut microbiota that give us information about the chemical and physical content, not only of our food, but of what that says about the world around us, and whether we should be sick or healthy, or whether we should have an immune response. The idea of knowing is bound up in biological processes that we can't reduce to simply metabolism or reproduction. They have to have some sort of epistemological basis. And so that's why we have the name Epistolution.
I love what you just said. You said the idea of knowing is bound up in biological process.
Right, yeah.
And that knowing doesn't just come later as a result of a biological process that's just gone on and on and on, and suddenly there's knowing. You put it way earlier.
Right, exactly. The concept is that if you have knowing as an emergent phenomenon at the end of evolution, it remains as a mystery, but it doesn't do the work that it could do in helping explain how natural selection could get going in the first place and how organisms could use their DNA as tools, instrumentally, as instruments to accomplish the task that they set about wanting to accomplish. All we have to do is reimagine what sorts of structures can learn about the world and what sorts of structures can become subjectivities. And this doesn't depend on consciousness. It really is not a hypothesis about consciousness. I don't know what role consciousness plays, but I do know that it forms a much better explanation if we say that all cells can be subjective. They can have a subjectivity, and they can also scale up and be part of a larger subjectivity that can form at the level of the organism.
And to put a fine point on it, why do we call it epistolution?
Well, it's just a combination of epistemology and evolution. And it's saying that there is no evolution without epistemology. Without the pursuit of knowledge, evolution could not occur in the first place.
Why is this such a challenging idea?
I think this is a really challenging idea because it hinges on just a few words, but it reinterprets almost everything in the biological sphere, and that's almost everything that we care about. And so it has consequences that are really, really far-ranging. And when you see those, when you keep thinking about it and you keep following those consequences, you come to a really different point of view. It's really tricky because it's a really deep reframing of the way that we've been so accustomed to looking at life in this sort of instrumentalist way, where we say, like, everything's about solving problems. It's about problem solving, and we can really reduce every problem that's being solved in nature. The problem that's being solved is survival and reproduction. And we're saying, no, it's not. It's subjectivity. It's building a worldview. It's understanding the world, just like we are. Most of the things that we do can't be reduced to survival and reproduction. Most of the things we do for curiosity, for whim, for fun, for out of fear. We do them. They don't have anything to do with reproducing more humans. Skiing or studying philosophy. None of that has anything to do with producing more humans. And if you really thought about how to optimize producing humans, your life would look really, really different from how it probably looks right now.
I do have a lot to say about skiing, and I generally think it's useless, but that's not a popular view. So what characteristics would a solution have to have? You talk about this universal mechanism, and I know you're looking for it. What are the essential characteristics and possible mechanisms?
Yeah, so the characteristics a solution would have to have, it would have to happen in every single cell on Earth, every living cell, not every virus, but every living cell, every cell that can use DNA as a tool. And so that means it has to be some process that's physically very, very common and uses, materials that are ubiquitous, that are in every single cell. And so really there are not that many materials that are in every single cell.
Yeah, it sounds like it narrows the search.
It narrows the search tremendously. There's really just like membranes and water and like a few other things that, are totally ubiquitous. And so we have to look at the way that those things relate to one another with these new eyes, like look at those as cognitive processes and try to understand what about them could be accumulating knowledge.
What else would Epistolution explain elegantly? And try to keep it to a short list, Charlie.
Yeah, well, for fairly complicated reasons, it would explain senescence, which is why we grow old instead of just remaining fit specimens until we die by accident. It would explain sleep, why we have sleep and wake cycles instead of just staying awake until we starve to death. It would also explain the problem of beauty, or in other words, why things are beautiful, not why there are arbitrary variations that are sexually selected, but why those variations are beautiful and why other lineages are beautiful to us. It would explain the microbiome, how an acquired community of organisms can function as a coherent organ of a multicellular organism. That there's an acquired component to our bodies that is just as functional as the inherited component. It would also explain symbiogenesis, which is when two unrelated organisms combine together and reproduce together and become the same organism, like our mitochondria or the origin of chloroplasts in plants. And it would also explain technological and moral progress, which is a way of sort of rebelling against our genetic inheritance.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the search for the mechanism, like what you want to dig into and what's ahead for Talking Octopus?
Yes, definitely. So the best conjecture we have right now is that epistolution is a form of harmonic resonance that happens mostly in water that's near hydrophilic membranes. So water near membranes that are hydrophilic adopts a semi-crystalline structure, and that's something that we're looking at as a potential reservoir for knowledge. So it's something that could absorb waves. Like knowledge comes to us in waves. Perception is waves, right? Waves of sound, waves of light. And we then turn those waves into a relationship inside our body. So epistolution would have to be something that can be spread from one domain to another. And so harmonic resonance, and more specifically synchrony, is, I think, a good way to mathematically and or physically and chemically understand what epistolution might be. And so that's the beginning of our empirical project to uncover what it is.
And my very last question, which isn't really a fair question because I'm not going to let you answer it. What did, in this conversation, we leave on the table that you would just love to dive into right now, but we're not going to?
Yeah, I would love to dive more into moral progress. I would love to dive more into sleep. I would love to dive more into beauty. Those are things that really profoundly affect us and affect our worldview, and they're directly changed by epistolution. And so taking on board the scientific concept also brings along with it these philosophical perspectives that I think are really nourishing and illuminating.
Great. Well, we're not going to talk about that today. We'll save that for the next one. But this was amazingly interesting. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
I look forward to the next one.
Awesome.